Pripyat was a city that seemed to have it all: modern apartments, schools, hospitals, and a young population with an average age of just 26. But what happened to this once thriving city that caused nearly 50,000 people to abandon it forever in just 36 hours? Pripyat was a city of the Soviet government and was for the workers and their families of the nuclear power plant, which was called the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. On April 26, 1986, just 16 years after the city was established, Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl power plant exploded during a safety test. Before the explosion, plant operators were preparing a test to see whether the reactor turbines could briefly provide emergency electricity if outside power failed. Before the test was performed, the reactor power was reduced very low and automatic safety systems were turned off or bypassed, and then RBMK reactor became highly unstable. RBMK is a power reactor, but instead of using water for both cooling and slowing down neutrons, it uses graphite blocks to sustain the nuclear reaction and flowing water to absorb heat. At 1:23 a.m., the test began. Operators reduced steam to the turbines. Because of the reactor's unstable condition and its dangerous design characteristics, power suddenly surged uncontrollably. An operator pressed the AZ5 emergency shutdown button. Instead of safely stopping the reactor, a flaw in the control rod design briefly increased reactivity. Power skyrocketed in seconds. The reactor vessel ruptured. The 2,000-ton upper biological shield was blown upward. Burning graphite and radioactive debris were scattered around the plant. The reactor core was exposed directly to the atmosphere. Firefighters arrived within minutes, many unaware they were being exposed to lethal radiation levels. Several would later die from acute radiation sickness. A radioactive plum spread across Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, much of Europe. The scary part was after the explosion, the residents living in Pripyat were not immediately told that Reactor 4 had exploded. The explosion happened, like I said, at 1:23 a.m., but the Soviet authorities initially tried to avoid panic and made it seem that the accident wasn't that severe. What made the disaster especially deadly wasn't the explosion itself, it was the invisible radiation released into the air. Unlike fire or smoke, radiation couldn't be seen, smelled, or felt. While residents watching the burning reactor from their balconies, many were unknowingly receiving doses of radiation that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Throughout April 26, many residents went about their normal life. Children were playing outside, people were shopping, weddings and public events continued. But that morning, some people noticed some strange signs. Metallic tastes, headaches, nausea, military activity around the plant, and iodine being distributed in some places. Officials gradually realized the scale of the disaster, but the public was still not given full information. Witness accounts describe people gathering on balconies, rooftops, and bridges roughly between 1:30 and 2 a.m. to watch the fire burning at the plant. The blaze and blue glow from the ionized air were visible from across the city, as Pripyat was only about 3 kilometers, 1.9 miles away. Firefighters arrived at 1:28 a.m., confirming the fire was already visible by then. One famous location was the so-called Bridge of Death, where residents reportedly stood during the early morning hours watching the reactor burn, unaware of the radiation danger. The story of the firefighters is so tragic because they weren't aware that the reactor core was exposed. They thought that they were fighting an industrial fire. The firefighters climbed onto roofs and areas with extreme high radiation levels. Many of the firefighters experienced symptoms within hours, including metallic tastes in their mouth, dizziness and headaches, severe nausea and vomiting, and radiation burns that looked like ordinary burns at first. They were initially being treated in Pripyat's hospital, and then the firefighters were transferred to a specialized hospital in Moscow. Several of the heavily exposed firefighters died within days to weeks from acute radiation syndrome, a condition caused by massive radiation exposure. One of the most well-known firefighters was Vasily Ignatenko, who helped fight the fires on the reactor roof. He received a fatal radiation dose and died about 2 weeks later. His story was featured in books and the HBO series Chernobyl. The firefighters' actions were crucial. By preventing the fire from spreading to other reactor units, they helped avoid an even larger disaster. Many are now remembered as heroes in Ukraine and around the world. While firefighters were dying and fighting for their lives in the hospital, the residents of Pripyat were still living in the city. Nearly 36 hours after the explosion on April 27, 1986, Soviet authorities issued the evacuation of Pripyat. Residents were told to only bring important things with them, including documents, food, and enough belongings for a few days. They were assured that they would be returning home sooner than later. More than 1,000 buses arrived to transport nearly 50,000 people away from the growing radioactive danger. People had left behind family photographs, toys, pets, clothing, and entire homes. Many had locked their doors expecting to be home after a few days. They never did. Within a few hours, one of Soviet Union's most modern cities became completely empty. Today, 40 years later, Pripyat stands completely frozen in time. Classrooms still contain books and desks. Apartments still hold people's personal belongings left to rot in time. The city's famous amusement park, which was supposed to open days after the disaster, has never welcomed a single paying visitor. Over the decades, nature has claimed most of the city. Trees growing through roads, buildings slowly decaying, and wildlife now roams areas that were once filled with 50,000 people. What started as a routine safety test lasted only seconds. Yet those few seconds changed thousands of lives forever and turned Pripyat into one of the most famous ghost towns in human history.